What happens when someone who believes they are untouchable crosses the wrong person? I never thought I'd find out until the day my boat disappeared, and I realized just how far some people would go to get what they wanted. Living near the water had always been a dream of mine. After years of commanding vessels in the Coast Guard, navigating storms and treacherous seas, I longed for a quiet place to call home. When I managed to buy a house in a gated community, complete with a private dock, it felt like everything had finally come together. My boat was my pride, sleek, well-equipped, perfect for fishing and escaping from the world. But there was Karen, the new HOA president, who moved into the blue house across the street. From the moment she arrived, it was clear she had a problem with everything. First, it was my boat. She complained it didn't fit the look of the neighborhood. Then she suggested that I shouldn't have special privileges, like a private dock. I brushed it off at first. People like her, with too much time and too little sense, were just nuisances. But ignoring her didn't make her go away. It made her bolder. Karen started pushing harder. At the HOA meetings, she'd bring up my boat, questioning why I was allowed to have it when others were following the rules. I thought about confronting her, but I knew better. People like Karen thrived on attention. So I kept to myself, stayed out of her way, and kept my distance. But that all changed one morning, a Saturday like any other. I woke up early, just as the sun was beginning to rise, excited to spend the day working on my boat. I made my coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and walked toward the dock. And that's when I felt it. The chill down my spine that only comes when something is terribly, unmistakably wrong. My boat was gone. At first, I thought I had just overlooked something. Maybe it was moved for cleaning. Maybe it was a mistake. Someone had taken it to fix the dock or do some maintenance. But when I looked closer, when I saw the mooring ropes had been cut, that's when it hit me. Someone had taken my boat, and they had done it carefully, with intention. I stood there for a few moments, blinking in disbelief. My mind raced. Who would steal a Coast Guard commander's boat? And how? It didn't make sense. I was calm by nature, but this was a violation. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling slightly. I tried to tell myself this was just some misunderstanding. But the truth was, I had no idea who could have done this. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. It felt like the boat had simply vanished. I turned on my boat's GPS tracker, which was always in place to keep tabs on it. When the screen lit up, my heart sank. The boat was out there. The tracker's signal pointed toward the open water. It was drifting farther from shore. I had no clue who had taken it or why, but I knew this wasn't a random act. Someone had taken my boat, and they were now out in the middle of the sea, likely with no clue what they were doing. I tried to think clearly, but my mind was racing. I was trained for moments like this, trained for handling the unexpected. But this was different. My boat wasn't just a possession. It was a part of me. And now it was gone. I stood on the dock for a moment, staring out at the water, feeling a mixture of frustration and disbelief. I needed to know what was going on, but I didn't have a plan. I didn't know who to call. The only thing I knew for sure was that my boat was drifting further from land, and I couldn't just stand there doing nothing. But what now? I didn't panic. That wasn't who I was. I could handle this. Or at least, I hoped I could. I tried to push back the rising anxiety and consider my options. Should I call the police? Should I reach out to the HOA? No, they weren't going to help with this. I had to figure it out myself. But how? I had no leads, no clues. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. There had to be something I could do. The boat had a tracker. Maybe I could find a way to use that. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I realized just how little I truly knew about what had happened. And as the minutes passed, I realized the most frustrating thing. I had no idea who was behind this. All I had were questions. And the answers? I had no clue where to find them. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, but the uncertainty was creeping in. My boat was out there, and I had no idea who had taken it or why. It wasn't like I had a whole list of enemies. I had been living in the neighborhood for years without much drama. But now my boat, stolen without a trace, drifting aimlessly in the open sea. I forced myself to think. The tracker was still active, showing the boat's location, but the question was, how long could I afford to wait? Every minute that passed, Karen's actions seemed more deliberate, more dangerous. It was almost as if she had a plan, but I couldn't figure out what that plan was. I went inside and grabbed my phone again, trying to find someone to call. But who? Who do you call when your boat's stolen in your own neighborhood? I didn't want to involve the police just yet. This wasn't exactly a typical theft. It didn't feel like someone just swiped my boat for the sake of it. There was something else at play here, something off. I dialed a few numbers, but no one answered. My fingers hovered over the contact list, searching for anyone I could reach. This wasn't just about a stolen boat anymore. It was bigger than that. This was about an intrusion, a violation. My mind kept going back to Karen. She was the only one who had the motive to do something this petty. But why hadn't anyone seen her? Why had no one heard anything? I glanced back at the tracker. The boat was now much further out. I had to act. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about what she might be doing out there, lost, panicked, and completely unprepared for what she'd gotten herself into. I grabbed the keys to my truck, slammed the door behind me, and drove straight to the Coast Guard base. I wasn't going to sit here and wait for someone else to handle it. The tracker was showing the boat still moving. It had to be Karen. I couldn't imagine anyone else being reckless enough to steal a boat like that, especially not in open water. The drive was a blur of thoughts. I had no plan, no idea how I was going to get the boat back, or how to deal with Karen when I did. My mind raced through different scenarios, each one worse than the last. What if she was really in danger? What if she'd sunk the boat? What if the sea had claimed her and my boat? I shook the thoughts out of my head. I had to focus. I had to act. I arrived at the base in record time and went straight to the main office, practically barging through the door. I didn't have time for formalities. I explained the situation as quickly as I could. My boat had been stolen, the GPS tracker showed it out in the water, and I needed help. The officer on duty didn't hesitate. He had a few questions, but I didn't have time for answers. I just needed action. Minutes later, I was on a patrol boat, my colleague at the wheel, heading straight for the coordinates. The tension was thick, the silence deafening except for the roar of the engines. I couldn't focus on anything but the boat out there. Karen was out there. I kept imagining her in that panic-stricken state, trying to steer the boat, probably making it worse every time she touched the wheel. As we got closer, I saw it. The boat, spinning in circles, aimlessly drifting further from shore. My heart skipped a beat, and then I heard it. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone was screaming, "Help! Help!" I don't know what to do. It was Karen's voice. The desperation in her tone was real. We were closing in fast, and as we got closer, I could see her. She was gripping the wheel, her hair wild and tangled, a look of utter panic plastered across her face. She was completely out of control. She wasn't just lost, she was terrified. I leaned over to my colleague and signaled to him to silence the engine. We coasted slowly toward her. I didn't want her to hear us coming. The moment we approached, I took the radio and keyed it. "This is the United States Coast Guard. Identify yourself." There was a long pause, followed by the frantic sounds of her voice. Oh my God, help me. I'm lost. The boat's broken." The last part I knew was a lie. The boat wasn't broken. She was just completely incapable of steering it. I couldn't help myself. I let out a dry laugh, though I quickly covered it up. "This is the United States Coast Guard. Please identify yourself immediately." Her voice came back, shaking. I'm not supposed to be here. I don't know what happened. Please, just get me out of here." I looked at my colleague and gave him a nod. He cut the engine completely, and we drifted in, silent now, the boat barely moving. And there she was, looking more pathetic than I had ever seen anyone in my life. Her face drained of all color when she saw me, the man who would now be in control of the situation. Her eyes widened with terror as the realization hit her. She had taken my boat. She had taken it without permission, and now she was stranded in the middle of the ocean, hopeless, utterly out of her depth. It was at that moment that everything shifted. The calm that I'd been holding onto started to fade. I couldn't believe what was happening. And just like that, I knew she wasn't going to get away with this. The silence between us felt like it stretched for miles, even though the boat was only a few feet away. She was still clutching the wheel, her fingers white-knuckled and trembling. Her gaze flickered between the sea, the boat, and then me, her captor, or at least the person who was about to make sure she learned a very hard lesson. "Do you know what you've done?" I asked, my voice calm, as though I were dealing with a routine rescue. But underneath that calm was a storm of emotions I couldn't entirely suppress. She didn't answer right away, her eyes darting everywhere, looking for a way out. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came out. Then, finally, she stammered, I thought it would be fine. It was just a quick ride. I didn't know it was such a big deal. I kept my voice even, but I could feel my frustration building. A quick ride? You cut the ropes. You stole my boat. Do you know what kind of trouble you're in right now? Her face was a mix of disbelief and panic. I wasn't stealing it. I didn't know it was a crime. I thought you wouldn't mind. It was just a little ride. She was desperate now, trying to find an excuse, any excuse to get out of this mess. My patience was wearing thin, but I stayed calm. This wasn't just about the boat anymore. This was about respect, about a woman who thought the rules didn't apply to her simply because of who she was. And now, I had her cornered. I leaned closer, making sure to maintain control of the situation. You took the boat without permission. You had no idea how to steer it. You had no business being out here. You're not just a misguided neighbor anymore. You're a criminal. She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a hand to silence her. You're lucky I'm the one here and not someone else. If anyone else had found you, this wouldn't have gone so smoothly. You'd be facing a far worse situation than a simple rescue. I could see the weight of those words hit her. She was realizing the gravity of what she'd done, but her pride was too strong to let her admit it. Still, I could see it in her eyes, fear, regret, a hint of panic now that she knew the Coast Guard wasn't about to let her walk away from this. I looked at my colleague, who had been quiet throughout the entire ordeal, letting me take the lead. His expression was unreadable, but I could see the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. I couldn't blame him. This situation was almost comical if it weren't for the very real consequences Karen was facing. I turned back to her, holding my composure. We're going to get you back to shore, but make no mistake, this isn't over. You'll be answering for this. There will be a formal investigation, and you'll have to deal with the consequences of your actions. Her face contorted into an expression of disbelief. No, you can't do this. I'm a respectable person. I'm not some criminal. The desperation in her voice was almost pathetic. Respectable, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. You don't get to claim respectability when you're stealing from someone who served this country. You don't get to play the victim now. I stepped back, gesturing to my colleague to start maneuvering the boat. We'll take you back to shore, and then you'll deal with the authorities. We'll let them sort out how respectable you are. As we made our way back, the reality of the situation sank in for her. She had been the one who thought she could do whatever she wanted, that no one would call her out on her behavior. And now she was facing the consequences. The boat was relatively quiet now. Karen didn't try to argue anymore. She sat there, slumped, staring at the floor, as if trying to convince herself this wasn't happening. The silence between us was only broken by the hum of the engines as we made our way back to land. When we finally docked, the reality of the situation was clearer than ever. An officer was already waiting on the shore. Karen's face went pale when she saw him. Her voice shook as she tried one last time to salvage her dignity. I didn't mean any harm. It was just a misunderstanding. Please don't do this. But there was no way out. The Coast Guard had already done its job, and now the rest was in the hands of the law. I'm afraid this is out of my hands now, I told her calmly as the officer approached. You'll be making a statement at the station. The boat owner has the right to file a formal complaint. Her face twisted in horror. You're really going to do this? You'll ruin me. I stood there silent. She was right. She was about to face the consequences of her actions, and there was nothing she could do to stop it now. As the officer led Karen away to make her statement, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. She had gotten herself into this mess, and now she was going to have to face the music. I watched her walk slowly, her head hanging low, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. But something nagged at me. Why had she done it? Why had she taken my boat, especially when she knew the risk? Karen had always carried herself with a certain air of entitlement, but this felt different. There had to be more to it. I took a step closer to the officer, just before he ushered Karen into the interrogation room. What exactly happened? I asked him, wanting to know the full story. The officer paused for a moment, glancing back at Karen. Well, it seems she was trying to prove something to herself, maybe. I don't know, but she thought she could just borrow your boat like it was hers to take. But her pride wouldn't let her admit it when things went wrong. That made sense. The more I thought about it, the more it all clicked. Karen wasn't just stealing my boat. She was stealing her own sense of control. She wanted to prove something, and when things went sideways, her arrogance got the best of her. The more desperate she became, the more she clung to the lie that it was just a misunderstanding. I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. She had taken the boat, but in doing so, she had lost herself. Her pride was her downfall. I knew she wasn't the kind of person to admit mistakes, and yet she had been caught in a lie that she couldn't untangle. As I stood there, watching Karen get led into the station, I realized that my role in this had ended. I had done my part, held her accountable, ensured she faced the consequences. It wasn't about the boat anymore. It was about teaching her a lesson that she'd never forget. But as I turned to leave, I heard her voice once more, calling out from the doorway. "Please, please, don't leave me here," she pleaded. I stopped, feeling the weight of her words. There she was, the woman who had tried to take my boat, the woman who had arrogantly assumed she could break the rules and get away with it, reduced to begging for help. For the first time, the facade had cracked, and all that was left was someone who had made a terrible mistake and couldn't fix it. But I wasn't here to fix it. I wasn't here to save her from her own pride. I had given her a chance to learn a lesson, and it was clear now that it was too late for her to change. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, staring at the ground, helpless and broken. As I reached the gate and climbed into my truck, I could still hear her voice echoing in the distance, but I didn't look back. This was the last time I was going to help her. It was over.